There are a number of problems. One was, what's it for? You know, is this just there to entertain cognitive psychologists? At that time, I was fortunate in some Italian collaborators, Beppe Vallar and Costanza Papagno, who had identified a patient in Italy with a very pure phonological short-term memory deficit. And so we got a small grant and I went over to Italy and we would go and test her in Turin. She ran a shop that sold sort of tourist antiques and things of this sort, and we would go along and she'd put the closed notice in the window and we'd then test her short-term memory and see what she could and couldn't do. And the idea was that given that her intelligence was normal, her long-term memory was normal, her language was normal, if we found out what she couldn't do, this would tell us what the phonological loop was for. Well, we started off testing her comprehension. We did find that if we had long enough sentences and sentences carefully designed so that you needed to remember the first word right up to the end in order to disambiguate it, we couldn't make her fail. But it seemed unlikely that evolution had actually prepared us just to cope with sort of badly written prose. And so we tried another line. We thought, well, maybe it's learning new phonological material. So we decided we'd try and teach her Russian vocabulary. So we presented her visually or auditorily with a sequence of 8 Russian words. She had to learn the Italian equivalent. Or we gave her the task of learning to associate pairs of unrelated words in her native Italian. And we reckoned that that should be based on semantic memory and should be unimpaired. And we compared her with a group of 8 people matched for age and intelligence. What we found was that on the Italian words she was absolutely fine, absolutely normal. But the Russian vocabulary, she was terrible. At the end of 10 trials, she'd not mastered a single Russian word. And so that had told us, given us a hint that, okay, this seems to be a system for acquiring language. But it's always important to replicate, and we didn't have access at that time to another similar case. So we fell back on our old strategy of turning our student subjects into patients by giving them things that would, in this case, block their phonological loop. So we had them learning vocabulary while suppressing articulation, blah, 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 blah. Or we varied the length and so forth. And what we found was that, as predicted, this didn't interfere with paired associate learning in their native language, but it did interfere with acquisition of new material. And since then, it's been shown, I think, fairly clearly that there is an association between this system and the ability to learn a second foreign language. But what about native language? Maybe that's immune. Well, we were able to test that. I got a new person who'd been a postdoc with Donald Broadbent in Oxford, who came to work with me and was looking around for a project when we had a visit from a linguist who talked about this rather interesting group of children with specific language impairment. So they had normal intelligence, but their language was several years behind what it should be. And we thought maybe, just maybe, they had a phonological loop deficit. We were lucky enough to find that there was a group of such children in Cambridge, and we studied them and found that, sure enough, they also had problems in learning new word forms. We found that they had problems in learning, first of all, nonsense syllables. We then developed a more specific test that targeted this by looking at non-words of different lengths. So they might be quite short words like, or non-words like ballop, or they could be quite long like blontus staping or woogalamic. And what we found was that for normal children, or indeed children who were the same language age as these, which was 2 years earlier, were pretty good with this. They had some trouble with the long words, but that our children with specific language impairment were greatly impaired, particularly as the words got longer. And in fact, this is now a standard test that's used as part of a diagnosis for dyslexia or specific learning impairment. That raised the question of, is it only children who have a major problem in this area that have difficulty, or is it true of the population as a whole? So we were able to interest local schools, and we took the whole of 1 year that was starting up, aged between 4 and 5, and we tested their non-word repetition, their intelligence, and their vocabulary, using a test in which you present 4 pictures and you speak the word of one of them, and the child has to point to that object, and they become, of course, less and less frequent until the child doesn't know the word. What we were able to show was that, yes, we did get a good correlation between our non-word repetition and vocabulary, and furthermore, that if we studied them over the next year, their non-word repetition predicted how much they would improve their vocabulary. And this has now been repeated lots of times. Interesting, the person who did this with me, Susan Gathercole, still works in this area and has hugely developed it, showing that tests based on working memory can be used to identify quite young children who are likely to have scholastic problems and problems of different sorts. And also there's now a strong suggestion that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, particularly the attention deficit part, is associated with working memory deficit, though not the phonological loop part. So we made, I think, a pretty good case for the role of the phonological loop in language acquisition, although it's important to point out that having a reduced phonological loop in and of itself doesn't mean that you won't acquire a good vocabulary, because as the child gets older, other factors come in. I mean, one being executive processes, because a lot of the vocabulary we acquire because of understanding what that unfamiliar word must mean in that context. And to do that, you need to understand what's going on. Also, of course, the richness of the language environment is important. But nevertheless, it still is an important factor in remembering names, remembering new words, and sometimes things like making spoonerisms, where you switch around initial letters, like park instead of car park.